Mason knelt at his late wife's grave the way he did every year, setting down the white flowers Grace had always loved. When he rose, a woman in a dark coat froze at the photograph on the headstone. Her face drained of color as she stepped closer and whispered 4 words that stopped his heart. I remember her. Mason had never once seen this woman before. She introduced herself as Charlotte, chief executive of a major medical company, and what she said next chilled him. Grace had left her proof before she died, and a message meant only for him. Stay until the end to discover the secret Grace hid and follow Mason's journey toward the truth she left behind. On a cool early autumn morning outside Richmond, Virginia, Mason Carter arrived at Oakwood Memorial Cemetery on the 3rd anniversary of his wife's death. Mason was 42 years old, a steady and broad-shouldered man who worked as a senior mechanical reliability engineer for an industrial equipment firm. He was the kind of father who showed up early, fixed what was broken without complaint, and rarely spoke about his own grief. 3 years after losing Grace, Mason no longer collapsed under the weight of it the way he had in the beginning, but he had also never truly moved forward. Every year on this date he brought the same white flowers she had always loved, set them gently against her headstone, and stood in silence for a long while before he could bring himself to leave. Mason and Grace had built a quiet, ordinary marriage together. Grace had worked in quality compliance for a medical device company before she left her job roughly a year before she passed away. She had always been thoughtful, careful, the kind of person who noticed small inconsistencies that others missed. As Mason prepared to walk back toward his car, he noticed a woman standing several steps away near another row of graves. She was Charlotte Hayes, 37 years old, Chief Executive Officer of Hayes Medical Technologies, one of the largest medical device companies in Virginia. Charlotte had come that morning to visit her own father's grave in the section nearby. But the moment her eyes landed on the photograph mounted on Grace's headstone, her entire expression changed. She walked closer, studying the name Grace Carter engraved beneath the photograph, and then said, very quietly, that she remembered her. Mason immediately grew guarded. He had never met this woman before in his life. Grace had never once mentioned knowing the chief executive of Hayes Medical. Mason asked how she had known his wife. Charlotte did not answer right away. She looked down at the grave and then explained that roughly 4 years earlier, Grace had walked into her office carrying a folder of documents. At the time, Charlotte had not yet become chief executive. Grace had warned her that a medical product the company was preparing to release had testing reports that appeared to have been altered. Charlotte said Grace was the very first person who made her question the leadership above her at the time. Mason stood frozen, stunned that Grace had never told him any of this. Charlotte continued, her voice lower now, saying that Grace had also left something behind for him. But before Mason could ask what she meant, Charlotte admitted she had not brought it with her. It had been sitting in her private safe for nearly 4 years, and until this very morning she had never known that Grace had died. On the envelope Grace had left behind, Charlotte said there was a single handwritten line. It read that the contents should only be given to Mason if he ever came looking for her. Mason stood in the middle of the cemetery path, the white flowers still cradled in one hand, trying to reconcile the quiet, careful woman he had married with a story he was only now hearing for the very first time. That afternoon, Mason drove to the headquarters of Hayes Medical at Charlotte's invitation. The contrast between them was obvious the moment he walked through the doors. Mason lived a quiet, modest life raising his daughter alone. Charlotte ran a company worth billions of dollars. Yet she did not treat him as an outsider. She led him into her private office, knelt beside a small personal safe, and pulled out a worn brown envelope. The handwriting on the front belonged unmistakably to Grace. Mason recognized it instantly, the same careful slant she used for grocery lists and birthday cards alike. Inside the envelope were a short letter, a small flash drive, the reference number for an internal company file, and the name Joseph Bennett, a former chief operating officer of Hayes Medical. In the letter, Grace apologized to Mason for keeping secrets from him. She explained that while working at Hayes Medical, she had discovered that a group of managers had altered the testing results for a product called CardioSafe V7, a sensor system used inside cardiac monitoring devices. Grace had quietly backed up the original data before anyone could erase it. She had gone to Charlotte specifically because Charlotte was then a vice president of product development, known for staying outside internal politics. Charlotte reviewed what Grace brought her and confirmed she was telling the truth. But just before a formal investigation could begin, Grace suddenly resigned. For years, Charlotte had assumed Grace panicked and wanted to disappear from the situation entirely. Mason knew a different truth. Grace had resigned because her health had started failing. Within a year, she was diagnosed with a serious illness, and the 2 years that followed were consumed entirely by treatment. Mason finally understood why Grace had never wanted to pull him into a legal battle during that time. One line in the letter struck him hardest. Grace had written that if he was reading these words, she likely no longer had the chance to explain herself. She insisted she never wanted revenge against anyone. All she wanted was to make certain the real data never disappeared. Charlotte explained that the investigation 4 years earlier had eventually forced several executives out of the company. Joseph Bennett resigned before any formal action could be taken against him, though there was never enough evidence at the time to prove he had personally ordered the falsified reports. Charlotte later became chief executive and restructured the company from the ground up, replacing much of the old leadership and tightening the testing protocols that Grace had once flagged as broken. Yet the flash drive Grace had given her had remained encrypted, unreadable, sitting untouched in that safe for all these years, a locked door that Charlotte had never found a way through. At the end of the letter, Grace had written that Mason would know the password. Mason stared at the screen in front of him. He had absolutely no idea what password she could possibly mean. Charlotte then revealed something else. Joseph Bennett had recently returned to the industry and was quietly preparing to buy a controlling stake in one of Hayes Medical's most important supplier partners. Mason took a copy of the letter home but left the flash drive at the office safe for safekeeping. That evening, his daughter, Ella Carter, 9 years old, asked why he had come home so late for dinner. Mason simply told her he had met someone who once knew her mother. Ella did not press further, and she remained entirely outside the unfolding investigation, her world still built around homework, soccer practice, and bedtime stories. After Ella fell asleep, Mason opened the small memory box Grace had left behind years earlier. Inside were their wedding photographs, an old movie ticket stub, a handful of postcards, the paperback novel Grace had read a dozen times, and a train ticket from the very first trip they ever took together. Mason remembered something Grace used to say, that if she ever forgot every password in the world, she would still remember the place where the two of them began. That single memory changed everything. Mason realized the password had to be tied to where they first met. The next morning he returned to Hayes Medical, and together he and Charlotte began testing possibilities. They tried the name of the restaurant where they had their first date. It failed. They tried their wedding date. It failed. They tried Ella's name. It also failed. Then Mason remembered that Grace never considered their first real meeting to be that restaurant dinner at all. The two of them had actually met on Platform 7 at Richmond Main Street Station, the day Mason helped her gather a folder of papers that had scattered in the wind. He typed in a version built around that memory, and the drive finally opened. Inside were hundreds of files. The most important one was an audio recording. Grace had secretly recorded a meeting between Joseph Bennett and two testing managers. In the recording, Joseph could be heard instructing them to clean up the failure numbers before the board ever saw them. Charlotte sat completely still, stunned. This was the exact evidence that had been missing from the investigation 4 years earlier. Still, Mason refused to rush toward going public. As an engineer, he understood that data had to be verified before it meant anything. He suggested they check the metadata, the report versions, the original testing figures, and the full timeline of every file on the drive. Charlotte was quietly surprised by how composed he remained. Rather than chasing revenge on Grace's behalf, Mason only wanted to understand precisely what had happened, one careful step at a time, the same patient approach he brought to every machine he had ever repaired. Somewhere in the hours they spent hunched over the laptop screen, something quiet shifted between them. Charlotte began to notice how Mason listened before he spoke, how he never once raised his voice even when the recording made his jaw tighten. She had spent years surrounded by executives who postured and performed, and Mason did neither. He simply worked through the problem the way he might approach a failing part on a factory floor, methodically, without drama. For the first time, Charlotte found herself thinking of him not as Grace's widower, but as a man with steady principles she genuinely admired. Near the very end of the drive, one final file caught their attention. Its title reads simply, "If Joseph Comes Back." The file titled "If Joseph Comes Back" contained a set of notes Grace had written herself. In them, Grace explained her belief that Joseph was not the type of man who quietly accepted failure. He had spent years building an investment network, and she suspected he might eventually return to the industry under a different company name entirely. Charlotte confirmed that this had already happened. Joseph now served as chairman of Bennett Capital Health, a fund actively working to purchase shares in an important sensor supplier connected to Hayes Medical. If that deal succeeded, Joseph would gain direct leverage over the very company that had once forced him out. Mason suggested that Charlotte hand the data over to her attorneys and an independent forensic team rather than acting on their own. This choice mattered. Mason had no interest in playing detective, and Charlotte had no intention of pursuing anyone through unofficial or reckless means. Every piece of evidence needed to move through the proper legal process. Charlotte hired an outside data auditing firm to review everything on the drive. Their findings were clear. The files carried accurate timestamps. None of them had been altered after Gray originally saved them, and the original testing reports differed significantly from the versions that had been presented to the board years earlier. Still, her legal counsel offered a cautious warning. The evidence was strong enough to justify reopening a formal investigation, but it might not be enough on its own to prove that Joseph bore personal criminal responsibility. The company issued a brief, carefully worded statement acknowledging that historical testing data was under independent review, though it stopped short of naming anyone directly. Word of the internal review reached Joseph almost immediately. He called Charlotte directly. The conversation stayed polite on the surface, yet the threat underneath it was unmistakable. Joseph suggested that matters from 4 years earlier were best left undisturbed. Charlotte replied calmly that she had no intention of hiding any information connected to patient safety. When Joseph brought up Grace by name, Charlotte understood at once that he already knew she had kept a backup of the data all along. The danger that followed was not physical. It arrived instead through legal maneuvering and reputation warfare. Joseph's communications team began pushing the narrative that Charlotte was resurrecting an old scandal purely to sabotage a rival's business deal. Several members of the Hayes Medical Board grew nervous and quietly pressured her to drop the matter entirely. Mason felt a growing weight of guilt, worried that his arrival and the contents of that flash drive had pulled Charlotte into a crisis she never asked for. Charlotte refused to back down. She told him plainly that Grace had stood alone when she chose to do the right thing, and she would not allow her to keep standing alone now that she was gone. The words landed heavily on Mason, settling somewhere he had not expected. He had spent 3 years thinking of Grace only as the woman he lost, and now, piece by piece, he was learning the shape of the courage she had carried quietly for years without ever once mentioning it at their own dinner table. Not long afterward, the legal team uncovered something unusual buried in the file records. Grace had sent a second copy of the same data to someone else entirely, someone whose identity remained unknown. Mason and Charlotte worked with the legal team to identify who Grace had sent the second copy of the data to, careful never to pursue anything on their own outside the proper legal process. The law firm combed through archived correspondence and internal records, and one name surfaced. Abigail Turner, a former lead testing supervisor, had left the industry entirely shortly after the original scandal. Charlotte had long assumed Abigail was somehow involved in altering the reports. But Grace's own notes told a different story. She had written that Abigail was frightened, not corrupt. Abigail now lived in a small town roughly 2 hours outside Richmond. Charlotte wanted the legal team to reach out formally, but Abigail refused to respond to any of their letters. Mason decided to try a different approach. He wrote her a short personal note explaining that he was Grace's husband and simply wanted to understand what she had tried so hard to protect. Abigail agreed to meet him. At a quiet diner outside her town, she finally told the truth. Joseph had pressured her testing group directly, and 2 of her colleagues eventually agreed to alter the data under that pressure. Abigail had refused. Grace had secretly backed up the accurate reports before the old system was replaced entirely. Abigail still kept an email Joseph had sent her group, demanding they resolve the unacceptable variance before the final review took place. More importantly, she had also kept a personal meeting log recording exact dates, times, and every person present in those closed-door discussions. 4 years earlier, Abigail had stayed silent out of fear of losing her house, her insurance, and dragging her family into the fallout. Grace never once judged her for it. She had only told Abigail that if she ever found the courage, she should tell the truth. Sitting across from Mason now, Abigail finally decided she was ready. She agreed to sign a formal statement, giving investigators independent evidence that no longer relied entirely on the flash drive alone. After the meeting, Mason and Charlotte sat together in the parking lot for a long while. Mason admitted he felt as though he were discovering an entirely different version of the woman he had married. Charlotte gently reminded him that this did not mean he had failed to know his wife. Grace may simply have been trying to shield her family from carrying an additional burden during an already difficult time. Mason asked why Charlotte had kept that envelope safe for 4 full years. Charlotte confessed that Grace had likely saved her entire career. Without her warning, Charlotte might have approved a dangerous report without ever realizing the danger. She had always hoped that one day Grace would return so she could finally thank her properly. Mason looked at Charlotte differently in that moment. What had begun as an alliance built around a shared mystery was slowly becoming something gentler, something neither of them had expected to find in a parking lot outside a small-town diner. For a moment neither spoke, watching the evening light stretch long across the empty lot. Charlotte reached over and placed her hand briefly on his arm, a small gesture of quiet solidarity, then pulled it back almost as soon as she realized what she had done. Mason said nothing about it, but he noticed, and so did she. Not long after they returned to the city, word reached them that the situation had escalated far beyond a private legal review. Joseph had decided he would not wait quietly while his reputation came under threat, and he chose to strike first, publicly and aggressively. Joseph filed a lawsuit against Hayes Medical, accusing Charlotte of using stolen documents to manipulate an ongoing business deal. The lawsuit sent shockwaves through the company's shareholders. The board of directors called an emergency meeting almost overnight. A faction of members wanted Charlotte to step aside temporarily as chief executive to protect the stock price while the matter was resolved. Joseph used every available media contact to frame the story as a personal act of revenge rather than a legitimate safety concern. Reporters camped near the company's headquarters for days, and analysts speculated openly about whether Charlotte could survive the controversy. Investors grew anxious, and the stock dipped several points within a single week. Charlotte found herself facing a difficult choice. She could hand the entire matter over to her legal team and step back from public view, or she could continue standing publicly behind the investigation herself. Mason never once told her she needed to fight this battle for Grace's sake. He told her instead that this was her company, and any decision she made had to rest on her responsibility to her employees, her patients, and her shareholders, not on anyone else's memory. The fact that Mason refused to pressure her only deepened Charlotte's respect for him. Charlotte ultimately chose transparency. She announced publicly that the company was reviewing historical testing data, careful not to declare Joseph guilty of anything. She brought in an independent third-party firm and committed to releasing the final results once the review concluded. The decision kept her grounded and believable, a leader making a careful choice rather than wielding unchecked power. Around the same time, the forensic team uncovered something significant. The data Grace had preserved did more than prove the original reports had been falsified. It also revealed that once Grace warned Charlotte all those years ago, Charlotte had personally ordered the entire product batch halted before it ever reached widespread commercial release. Because of that decision, no large-scale rollout had ever occurred using the falsified figures. This proved that Grace had not only uncovered the wrongdoing, her warning had directly prevented serious harm from reaching real patients. Mason was overwhelmed learning, for the first time, just how significant Grace's impact had truly been. Charlotte decided that once the matter concluded, she would launch a permanent program protecting employees who reported safety concerns, naming it in honor of Grace. Mason initially resisted the idea, uneasy about turning his late wife's memory into a public relations campaign. It became their first real disagreement. Mason argued that Grace had always avoided attention of any kind. Charlotte countered that if the program genuinely protected other people, it was not promotion at all. Eventually, Charlotte agreed to compromise. The program would not use Grace's image, it would never share her personal story without the family's consent, and it would be overseen by an independent committee rather than company leadership. Mason realized, watching her adjust so quickly, that Charlotte was someone who genuinely knew how to listen, someone willing to bend her own plans the moment she understood they might cause harm rather than good. It was a quality he had not expected to find in someone who ran a company as large as hers. Soon afterward, Abigail called with an urgent update. She had found a recorded phone call proving that Joseph had known from the very beginning that Grace was the one who had secretly preserved the original data. The legal team confirmed the recorded phone call was admissible, since Abigail had personally participated in the conversation and preserved it according to the recording laws of her state. In the recording, Joseph could be heard saying that Grace was creating unnecessary exposure for the company. He instructed a subordinate to find a way to make Grace's complaint appear unreliable to anyone who might review it later. This single recording completed the picture. It proved Joseph had known about Grace's actions, proved his clear intent to discredit her, and directly connected him to the pressure campaign that followed. News of the recording spread quickly through the industry, and several journalists who had previously echoed Joseph's version of events quietly revised their reporting. Federal regulators formally reopened the case. Joseph was summoned to answer questions under oath. There was no dramatic confrontation or arrest, no scene of shouting in a parking garage. Instead, the true climax unfolded quietly, inside a civil hearing room and a tense boardroom meeting. Joseph continued to insist that his words had been taken out of context, that Grace had simply been a disgruntled employee, and that Charlotte was exploiting the memory of someone who could no longer defend herself. Mason attended the hearing but did not speak right away. When Joseph's attorney attempted to portray Grace as unstable and unreliable, Mason finally stood to speak as the representative of his wife's legacy. He did not tell a sorrowful story, he simply laid out the facts: Grace's professional history, her performance reviews, the exact timeline proving she resigned because of a serious illness, not fear, the fact that she never once sought any financial benefit from raising her concerns in the first place. Abigail testified next, calm and steady despite years of silence weighing on her voice, describing in careful detail the pressure she and her colleagues had faced and the moment she chose to say no. The forensic expert confirmed every file on the drive was authentic and untouched, walking the panel through the timestamps and version history line by line. Finally, an internal email was introduced into evidence. Joseph had written that once Grace was gone, the entire matter would become manageable. The wording did not prove Joseph had any connection to Grace's death, and the story never tried to twist itself into something it was not. Within the context of the email, Gone clearly referred only to Grace's departure from the company. But it proved, beyond any doubt, exactly what Joseph had intended: to remove anyone standing in his way of the truth. His credibility collapsed entirely in that room. The board of Bennett Capital suspended him from his position almost immediately, and the pending acquisition of the sensor supplier was frozen while investigators reviewed the entire matter from the beginning. Sitting in the gallery, Mason finally understood something Grace herself must have understood long before she ever wrote that letter. What she had feared most was never for her own safety. It was the quiet possibility that the truth would simply vanish the moment she no longer had the strength left to keep fighting for it. Sitting there in that gallery, surrounded by strangers who now understood exactly what his wife had done, Mason felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight for 3 long years. Several weeks later, the situation finally settled. Joseph stepped down from his position as chairman entirely. Regulators continued handling the remaining civil and corporate responsibilities tied to the case. Hayes Medical confirmed publicly that the halted product batch had been stopped before it ever reached a wide commercial release, sparing patients from any real harm. Charlotte retained her position as chief executive, her leadership stronger than it had been before the crisis began. Charlotte organized a small internal gathering rather than a large press event. There were no cameras, no headlines, nothing designed for outside attention. She announced the creation of an independent safety reporting protection fund. At Mason's request, the program did not carry Grace's name. Still, inside the headquarters, a small plaque was mounted quietly along an interior hallway. It read that doing the right thing should never require standing alone. Mason approved of this quiet form of remembrance far more than anything public ever could have offered. He had spent weeks worried that Grace's name might become a headline stripped of its meaning, and instead she had become a single sentence on a wall, seen only by the people who walked that hallway every day and understood exactly what it cost to live by it. This was also the point where the relationship between Mason and Charlotte began shifting away from the shadow of Grace's story entirely. Charlotte realized she no longer wanted to see Mason only in the context of old case files and legal reviews. Mason, in turn, noticed he was beginning to look forward to their conversations for their own sake, separate from anything connected to the investigation that had first brought them together. They met for coffee one afternoon. For the first time, neither of them mentioned Joseph at all. Charlotte opened up about her own past, admitting she had once been engaged years earlier. The relationship had ended because both of them had placed their careers above everything else, and afterward she had thrown herself into work almost entirely, filling the space where a personal life used to be. Mason admitted that returning to something resembling a normal life after losing Grace had proven far harder than the earliest months of raw grief. He confessed that whenever he felt even a small flicker of happiness, it carried the strange sensation of somehow betraying the person he had lost, as though moving forward meant leaving her further behind with every step. Charlotte did not try to argue him out of the feeling or rush him toward anything. She told him gently that remembering someone and continuing to live were never meant to be opposing choices. The words settled into him quietly, becoming one of the most important moments in his slow healing. Mason did not respond right away, sitting with the thought instead of brushing past it the way he usually did. But for the first time in 3 years, he began to consider that his future did not have to end at the edge of a cemetery. Before they parted outside the coffee shop, Charlotte gave him a brief, natural embrace, nothing more than that, yet it lingered with him the entire drive home. Nearly a full year after that first encounter beside the headstone, Mason returned once more to Grace's grave. He still brought the same white flowers. This time, though, his mood carried something different. He no longer arrived weighed down by guilt or unfinished questions. He came instead to tell her everything that had happened since. Standing quietly at her grave, Mason spoke as though she could hear him, explaining that the truth had finally come out, that Abigail no longer lived in fear, that new safeguards were now protecting other employees, and that Charlotte had kept every single promise she made. He took Grace's letter out one final time and read it slowly. On the back of the page, tucked near the edge of the paper where he had somehow overlooked it before, he found one more line written in her familiar handwriting. It said that if life ever gave him another reason to smile, he should never apologize to her for taking it. This final line was never meant as some kind of quiet arrangement pushing him toward anyone in particular. Grace had no way of knowing Charlotte would ever cross paths with him at all. The words were simply a message meant for whatever future waited for her husband, whoever might eventually be part of it. Mason laughed quietly through unexpected tears, the sound catching somewhere between grief and relief. He folded the letter carefully and pressed it against his chest for a moment, the way he might have once held Grace's hand across a hospital bed, before finally slipping the page back into his coat pocket. When he finally left the cemetery, Charlotte was not waiting nearby the way it might have unfolded in a more staged version of this moment. Instead, Mason called her from his car. He asked if she wanted to get dinner sometime soon. Charlotte teased that they had already shared several meals together over the past several months, given all the meetings and long working sessions they had sat through side by side. Mason told her that this time he wanted to call it something different. He wanted to call it an actual date. Charlotte went quiet for a few seconds before agreeing, her voice softer than usual when she finally spoke. This marked the clearest, most deliberate step either of them had taken toward one another. Mason was not replacing Grace, and Charlotte had no interest in stepping into the space that once belonged only to her. Whatever they were building together stood on completely different ground, shaped by everything that had happened over the past year rather than by anything either of them had lost. Driving home that evening, Mason found himself glancing at the passenger seat where the folded letter still sat, and for the first time since Grace's death, the sight of it brought him something closer to peace than sorrow. He rolled the window down slightly, letting the evening air move through the car, and allowed himself, quietly, to feel something like hope. 6 months passed after that first real date, and Mason and Charlotte continued seeing each other without any rush to define things faster than felt natural. Charlotte remained chief executive of Hayes Medical, steady and focused as ever. Mason kept his own job as an engineer rather than stepping into her world or suddenly taking on some new role because of their relationship. This choice mattered. It kept both of them independent, each still standing on their own ground, neither one absorbed into the other's life. Ella appeared only briefly near the very end of their story. Charlotte came to Mason's house one evening for dinner. Ella had already met her a few times before and treated her presence with easy, uncomplicated comfort. There was no forced moment where Ella called her anything beyond her name, no pressure toward marriage or a rearranged family structure. The evening simply unfolded the way ordinary evenings do. Plates passed across the table, small talk about school, nothing staged or symbolic. After dinner, Mason and Charlotte sat together on the back porch. He mentioned that he had visited Grace's grave that same morning. Charlotte asked gently whether bringing up Grace ever made her uncomfortable. Charlotte told him that Grace was simply part of his life, and she did not need to erase her memory in order to hold a place in whatever came next. This was the quiet payoff of everything they had built together. a mature kind of love that made room for the past instead of competing with it. A year after that first meeting at the cemetery, Mason and Charlotte attended the company's annual safety report announcement together. Charlotte never mentioned Grace's name publicly to the press. Still, the Whistleblower Protection Program had already received dozens of internal reports, catching several potential issues long before they could ever become real problems for patients. Abigail had become an independent advisor to the program, her voice now carrying weight instead of fear. Mason stood quietly near the back of the room, watching everything unfold. He understood that Grace would never be remembered through scandal or headlines. She would be remembered instead through the people who now found the courage to speak the truth because of what she once did alone. Once again, Mason stood at Oakwood Memorial. Mason set the white flowers down against Grace's headstone. Charlotte stood a respectful distance away, giving him the space he still needed in these quiet moments. Mason rested his hand gently against the stone and told her softly that he still remembered her. Then he turned around. Charlotte said nothing at all. She simply reached out her hand. Mason took it, and together they walked away from the cemetery, side by side, toward whatever came next. Loving someone new was never a betrayal of someone lost. A love once carried honestly could become a cherished memory rather than an anchor holding a person in place. Sometimes the person who helps carry us forward appears in the very place we thought we had only come to look back. And in the quiet years that followed, that was exactly how the people who loved Grace chose to remember her. Not through what she lost, but through what her courage had protected. Grace never set out to become anyone's hero. She simply refused to look away when something was wrong, and she trusted that the truth was worth protecting even if she never lived to see it come out. That quiet kind of courage rarely makes headlines, yet it changes everything for the people who come after, the ones who never have to face the same silence she once carried alone. Mason learned that loving someone new never erases the person who came before them, it simply makes room. If this story moved you, carry a little of Grace's courage into your own life, the willingness to speak the truth even when it costs something, and to believe that healing and love can still find their way back to us long after we thought the story had already ended.